just a little bit and we will dive in. August 2nd. We're going to be jumping out of Jeremiah and kind of looking at the era of Jeremiah's ministry. And it is obvious that Jeremiah is maturing, both as a young man and as a prophet of God. And he has been in a crucible of conflict and has emerged victorious. There will be more opposition and more personal sacrifice, but Jeremiah now has the fortitude to endure. Jeremiah will next be heard from after the reign of Josiah has ended. For now, however, the scene changes to a nation that's on the brink of a thorough, if brief, spiritual revival. And what a great moment that must have been in the land. Perhaps Jeremiah's preaching has been more effective than he realizes. When one plants the seed, he never knows when it will bear fruit. In the 18th year of Josiah's reign, now if we're picking up in verse 3 here of Kings, and of Kings 22, and if we look back at Kings 1, and we have looked at this in the past, certain parts of this, and alluded to it in different texts, but in Kings 1, we see Josiah emerge on the throne at a really relatively young age, 8 years old. And he's in the super uber corrupt culture. And, you know, his dad had a short reign, but was no great shakes. And his grandfather had a last end of life kind of renewal, but had been a horrible king. And now it's his turn to take the throne. And at 8 years old, he has a soft heart towards God. Now that continues to mature, this soft heart towards God. And in the 18th year of his reign, so he'd be 26, Josiah's reign, he's decided to purify the land and the temple. Remember, they got Asher poles up on the hills and places to worship all over the place. And he sent Azaliah and how do you say this? Messiah. I can't be Messiah, right? Messiah, the ruler of the city, to Joas, son of Joaz, the recorder, to repair the temple of the Lord his God. Go up to Hezekiah, the high priest, and have him ready the money that has been brought into the temple of the Lord, which the doorkeepers have collected from the people. So people are going in the temple. There's a box on the door where they're collecting the money, and have them entrust that money to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple, and have these men pay the workers who repair the temple of the Lord, the carpenters, the builders, the masons. Also have them purchase timber and dress stone to repair the temple. But they need not account for the money entrusted to them, because they're honest in their dealings. So he goes and takes the money that's been collected in the temple to give it to these workers to go and repair the temple. They went to Hilkiah, the priest, and gave him the money that had been brought into the temple of God, which the Levites, who were the gatekeepers, had collected from the people of Manasseh, Ephraim, and the entire remnant of Israel, and from all the people of Judah and Benjamin and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Then they entrusted it to the men appointed to supervise the work of the Lord's temple. These men then took that money and paid the money. They also gave the money to the carpenters. They paid the workers and repaired the destroyed the temple. They gave the money to the carpenters and the builders to purchase and dress stones, the timbers for the joists and the beams and the buildings and the kings of Judah had allowed to fall into ruin. The workers labored faithfully. Over them to direct them were Jaath and Obadiah, Levite descendants from Miriah, and Zechariah and Meshullam, descendants of Kohath. The Levites, all who were skilled at playing musical instruments, had charge of the labor and supervised all the work. And that's really important just for you to note, Josh, that a lot of times they evidently were given jobs outside of their preferred musical professions. Now they're in charge of a building project. Keep that in mind in case a building project comes our way. This could be very instrumental text for us to record here.
Yeah, nothing surprises me.
Other duties as assigned here, right?
That's right.
They had charge of the laborers and supervised all the workers from the job to job. Some of the Levites were secretaries and scribes and gatekeepers. While they were bringing out the money that had been taken in the temple of the Lord, Hilkiah, the priest, found the book of the law. So they're moving this stuff around. They're kind of cleaning up the place and moving things around, and and all of a sudden they're like dusting off a Bible. Was probably a scroll. The scroll is probably in a clay vase, a pot, but they move something around. They're like, oh, what is this? And they find these treasures of Scripture, the sacred text, the Torah has been found. They've never even been reading it. Hezekiah Josiah's got all this kind of inclination to be following after God and doing the right thing for the temple. But he's never even read the Word of God. He doesn't have any idea. And Hilkiah says to Shaphan, the secretary, I found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. Who knew that thing would have been there? And he gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan took the book to the king, and he reported to him, your officials are doing everything that has been committed to them. Now, this isn't the most important thing he's reporting, evidently. They've paid out the money that was in the temple of the Lord, and they've entrusted it to the supervisors and the workers. Then Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, oh, and by the way, a little side note, Hezekiah, the priest, has given me a book. Do you want me to read some of it? And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king, first time, right, hears the words of the law, he just rips his garment, a sign of deep mourning in their culture, right? He tore his robes and gives orders to Hezekiah and Eliakim, and son of Shaphan, Abaddon of Micah, and Shaphan, the secretary, and Asa, the king's attendant, go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the remnant in Israel and Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that is poured out on us because of those who have gone before us have not kept the word of the Lord. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written in this book. And Todd, I'll give it to you there.
All right. Hilkiah and those the king had sent with him went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, son of Takath, the son of Hazra, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. She said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the man who sent you to me, this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people. All the curses written in the book that has been read in the presence of the king of Judah. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and aroused my anger by all that their hands have made, my anger will be poured out on this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before God when you heard what he spoke against this place and its people, and because you humbled yourself before me and tore your robes and wept in my presence, I have heard you, declares the Lord. Now I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I am going to bring on this place and on those who live here. So they took her answer back to the king. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by his pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, and to obey the words of the covenant written in this book. Then he had everyone in Jerusalem and Benjamin pledge themselves to it. The people of Jerusalem did this in accordance with the covenant of God, the God of their ancestors. The king ordered Hilkiah the high priest, the priests next in rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley and took the ashes to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense in the high places of the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem, those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations, and to all the starry hosts. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, the quarters where women did weaving for Asherah. Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He broke down the gateway at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which was on the left of the city gate. Although the priests of the high places did not serve at the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. He desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Moloch. He removed from the entrance to the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. He pulled down the altars the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz, and the altars Manasseh had built in the two courts of the temple of the Lord. He removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble into the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem on the south of the Hill of Corruption, the ones Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. Furthermore, Josiah got rid of the mediums and spiritists, the household gods, the idols, and all the other detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem.
This he did to fulfill the requirements of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest had discovered in the temple of the Lord. Josiah removed all the detestable idols from all the territory belonging to the Israelites, and he had all who were present in Israel serve the Lord their God. As long as he lived, they did not fail to follow the Lord, the God of their ancestors. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them and burned on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things. The king asked, "What is that tombstone I see?" The people of the city said, "It marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done." Highlight that real quick. "Leave it alone," he said. "Don't let anyone disturb his bones." So they spared his bones and those of the prophet who had come from Samaria. Just as he had done at Bethel, Josiah removed all the shrines at the high places that the kings of Israel had built in the towns of Samaria and that had aroused the Lord's anger. Josiah slaughtered all the priests of those high places on the altars and burned human bones on them. Then he went back to Jerusalem. Josiah celebrated the Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, and the Passover lamb was slaughtered on the 14th day of the first month. He appointed the priests to their duties and encouraged them in the service of the Lord's temple. He said to the Levites who instructed all Israel and who had been consecrated to the Lord, "Put the sacred ark in the temple that Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, built. It is not to be carried about on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people Israel. Prepare yourselves by families in your divisions, according to the instructions written by David, king of Israel, and by his son Solomon. Stand in the holy place with the group of Levites for each subdivision of the families of your fellow Israelites, the lay people. Slaughter the Passover lambs, consecrate yourselves, and prepare the lambs for your fellow Israelites, doing what the Lord commanded through Moses. Josiah provided for all the lay people who were there a total of 30,000 lambs and goats for the Passover offerings, and also 3,000 cattle, all from the king's own possessions. His officials also contributed voluntarily to the people and the priests and Levites. Hilkiah, Zechariah, and Jehiel, the officials in charge of God's temple, gave the priests 2,600 Passover offerings and 300 cattle. Also, Conaniah, along with Shemaiah and Nathaniel, his brothers, and Hashabiah, Jael, and Jozabad, the leaders of the Levites, provided 5,000 Passover offerings and 500 head of cattle for the Levites.
The service was arranged, and the priests stood in their places with the Levites in their divisions, as the king had ordered. The Passover lambs were slaughtered, and the priests splashed against the altar the blood handed to them, while the Levites skinned the animals. They set aside the burnt offerings to give them to the subdivisions of the families of the people to offer to the Lord, as it is written in the book of Moses. They did the same with the cattle. They roasted the Passover animals over the fire as prescribed, and boiled the holy offerings in pots, cauldrons, and pans, and served them quickly to all the people. After this, they made preparations for themselves and for the priests, because the priests, the descendants of Aaron, were sacrificing the burnt offerings and the fat portions until nightfall. So the Levites made preparations for themselves and for the Aaronic priests. The musicians, the descendants of Asaph, were in the places prescribed by David, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun. Try not to say He-Man when I read that one. And Jeduthun, the king's seer. The gatekeepers at each gate did not need to leave their posts, because their fellow Levites made the preparations for them. So at that time, the entire service of the Lord was carried out for the celebration of the Passover and the offering of burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord, as King Josiah had ordered. The Israelites who were present celebrated the Passover at that time and observed the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days. The Passover had not been observed like this in Israel since the days of the prophet Samuel, and none of the kings of Israel had ever celebrated such a Passover as did Josiah, with the priests, the Levites, and all Judah and Israel, who were there with the people of Jerusalem. This Passover was celebrated in the 18th year of Josiah's reign. The other events of Josiah's reign and his acts of devotion in accordance with what is written in the law of the Lord, all the events from beginning to end, are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. Josiah's reign is truly a high point in the history of Judah, but it will not be enough to atone for 3 centuries of sinning on the part of Israel. The apparent lesson is that sin sometimes sets in motion certain consequences which even subsequent good intentions cannot forestall. Ouch. You're muted, Mark.
Yay and yikes, right? I mean, it's like, good. You know, it's like, it's unfortunate that, you watch this story unfolding in your mind's eye, and you kind of want this to have a happy ending, and we know that in the near term, it's going to be a disaster story nonetheless. And before we jump into questions, anything that you guys wanted to look back and reflect on?
Well, Bob made an interesting observation that I caught in the chat, Mark, about, this, obviously Josiah was probably a wildly popular king in many respects, but there were no doubt resistors. Oh, and those, so I'm kind of thinking ahead a little bit to after this, when God still was going to rain down judgment, even in spite of all the good that had been followed through on, right? And what would an impact? Well, how would that impact things after this? Because would there be these resistors who would say, well, Where's your God now? Look at what happened. You know, he didn't do what he said he was going to do. Everything is bad again.
Right. Well, and in part, we've kind of been on this timeline a little bit, and now we're in a way kind of circling back just a hair. And so we know that that inside of the timeline, that when Josiah steps down, the people revert right back to their old ways. I mean, there's obvious to me, I think, that he had a strength of leadership. I mean, it wasn't just a determined leadership. There was a strength in his leadership that would have brought about this destruction of these old things. You know, a number of years later, you know, he's gone, and people are like, yeah, you know what I really miss? I miss the old ways we used to do things, and I want to go do that. And they reverted right back to a lot of that old stuff, and they just stayed with what they knew, and it was a horrible outcome for them.
Yeah, this answered the question. Well, partly someone had asked in a previous chat, you know, was there a remnant? What happened to anybody who was good when they were exiled? And, you know, this points out that God laid those people to rest. He didn't even want them to see the captivity that was to come, which was sort of a blessing to them.
Yeah, he allowed and permitted people to enter into eternal rest apart from the horrible pain of captivity that was about to be brought to bear on them, right?
Yeah. I have a couple more things just to point out real quick.
Yeah, one of the
You'd
things,
ask. Oh,
one of the things too, you know, part of the reason we are familiar with this is, Seth, you might remember it was about 2 months ago that you first brought this story into one of our readings as a reflection, and then we've kind of circled back to it a few times in the reading. So for some of you, if you've been here daily for the last few months, some of this might sound familiar, and we have Seth to hold accountable for that. So anyway, yes, Seth.
Yeah, I had, I highlighted just a couple things.
You want to steal the screen?
No, it's just, no, because it was just on page 4. It was just a quick little thought that I had that, you know, when they find the book of the law, it was just interesting to me. I don't know that it actually says it, and I hadn't searched it up yet, but I was curious how often, because I know that it was fairly often that they would rewrite the book of the law letter by letter. But I'm just curious how long it had been since the last edit, because this has obviously been in the temple and it was hidden away for years. And I'm just curious at what point the book of the law stopped that they're reading from, because we have to remember they don't have the whole Bible's history and context. I was just really curious what was the last reading they had in theirs. And then the other thing I just noticed was just pointing out again, regardless of how culture treated women, this is another example where a woman was given a high place when it was the prophetess. It was the prophetess's answer that was taken back to the king.
Yeah.
When this momentous occasion happened. And I just think that's good that this, in my opinion, occurrence of honor, high honor, was given to a woman in the story.
Great observation with that. And the other part of that that's so interesting is that it gives it to us without seeming unusual or like that was a big deal. It's not like, and here's the, I forget her name here, but the prophetess, it's like the one and only, the very unusual, surprising woman prophet. I mean, it was like part of happenstance almost that was in the text. And I like that too, because it gives us a glimmer into the fact that they didn't see that as special or unusual, or they would have referenced it as special or unusual. So, I mean, there's something really powerful about that. I think we get a real a mistaken understanding of what the role of women has been in the history, you know, and really the last, I think, 2,000 years has not been as bad for women given the culture that they came out of, but it's not as good as it ought to be by a long shot. And it's like so many things, like with slavery and with so many things, it's this slow movement. It's not like that was the ideal, and it's not like we're at the ideal. We want to see continued growth and movement towards greater investment into the leadership gifts that people have and the right appropriate use of their spiritual giftings in so many ways, right?
Yep. And then the one last thing, I don't know the answer, so probably not a lot to talk about, but I found it interesting that it didn't refer to, it said, it marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done. But I'm pretty sure it's Elisha. When I just did some quick searches, I found the verse in 2 Kings where Elisha went up to Bethel. So he was speaking out against Bethel. And then I was just reminded of the comedy of the chapter where they said, "Get out of here, Baldy."
Yeah. And ultimately, isn't it Elijah's bones that get moved and healed and stuff happens?
Yeah.
Yeah. So good that they kept it. Good stuff. What are some of the specialized skills needed in the operation of the local church? When we look at that, I think there's a couple things that are worthy of observation, and I'm just going to jump to another screen real quick. There's this concept of what's often referred to today as the fivefold ministry that's based in Ephesians chapter 4. And we see there that there's apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors or shepherds, and teachers as offices of the church. And this is usually seen in word of faith movements and sometimes in some of the more charismatic circles where they'll discuss and talk about those fivefold ministries. But what we want to remind ourselves of as we're looking at it is that the foundation of the prophets and the apostles, those offices are usually seen by the vast majority of the church as having expired offices. Those are offices that aren't, that were important, that laid the foundation for which the rest of this is being built, though we still will typically see the idea of evangelists, pastors, shepherds, teachers, those kinds of roles as relevant for the church today. In my mind, and this is kind of one of the things that that I've tried to do with our church, and it's not, like a universal thing, but I try to think of, it's not so important to me what people are called. It's what people are gifted and empowered to do that matters, and there's a spiritual gifting that's on people's lives. And let's try to elevate the spiritual gifts that God has entrusted to people and free up people to do their unique gifting and the way that God has hardwired them, rather than think of offices. What does it look like, and what does it mean to have a church that's really led by leaders, evangelized by evangelists, that's administrated by administrators, that's cared for by people with gifts of mercy, that you get people that are oriented with spiritual giftings released, and that it becomes the job of the professional clergy not to so much do the ministry, but to raise up the saints for works of service, that we raise up the church and empower the church and release the church in a somewhat decentralized kind of an operation, not a top-down motif, but a affirming of gifts and a sending out into the nature of who they are in a strategic fashion, and then provide some support to that work and effort, I think is the wisest way to build a expression of the church. And so that's what I labor to do. But what do you guys see as it relates to specialized skills needed then and or now to do this kingdom kind of work?
Well, I appreciate that so much. I know I've looked at that text in Ephesians and other parts of the Bible and kind of wondered about it before, and wondered, are we doing that? Are we supposed to be doing that? But I love that context because it's true. And I'm incredibly thankful that there's a such thing as anointing, and that God gives pastors and evangelists often the gift of discernment and seeing anointing. And I know for me, like I have this job, and I'm not saying, oh, I'm anointed, you know, I'm just saying I have this job because of that. Like I don't have a lot of, just being completely transparent here, I don't have a lot of the credentials I'd like to have yet. And but I know there's a calling on my life, and I know that God showed that to Pastor Mark and others, and because of that I am where I am, and God uses that, and I believe that with all my heart. Like that is more powerful than anything else. But that being said, you know, it's like now I'm in a place where I can step into that calling and anointing, and I can continue to learn and grow as I'm there. But yeah, like I am thankful for that. And I was actually chatting with Pastor Mark yesterday just about gifts and personalities. And I don't know if you guys have ever taken personality tests. There's some basic ones, but I've had the opportunity to get into some deep ones and look at a piece of paper that literally tells me in numbers and words who I am. And that's, I don't know why I'm getting into that. I just think it's really interesting. It's like, whoa, I can see who God made me. I can actually see it on paper, and the gifts he's given me. Like we can figure those things out. You know, he gives us that opportunity and then use it in our ministry. And that's really what the church is all about.
Seth?
Yep. No, I think that's great, Josh. And, you know, I think that that joy and energy that Josh is talking about is in so many other areas. And in this verse here is described lots of them with builders and the doorkeepers, the money receivers, and just everything that went into the construction of the temple. And I've seen it at our church. You know, when I first came to the church, one of the first jobs that I did wasn't even something that I had really a skill to do, but they helped teach me, was putting all the wood chips in the planter boxes in our driveway at church. And there's just so many things that people at our church help out and do with their skills and their gifts.
You know, one of the interesting things about that, Seth, and I've never said this before, but you showed up that first day to help kind of spruce up the grounds, and you brought with you dried fruit and nuts and beverages and refreshments. And I put a note in a system that I was using to kind of keep track of what I wanted to remember about people. And I put down, Seth has a gift of hospitality.
That's funny.
Yeah. You know,
True.
and
that is true. Went to UNLV for hospitality.
And I also put a note that said, he's not good at labor.
That is more true.
Put a note that says Seth likes old technology.
I just thought it was really, really funny, and I've never said it. I mean, I try to keep straight what observations I make about people, because it comes to help me later. But I knew that first day that I wasn't going to be trying to recruit you. If you show up, awesome, but I wasn't going to recruit you for work that requires hammers.
I think that was actually my last attempt also at helping out in labor. Like, well, I tried.
I want to real quick press in a little bit to what Tanya brought up in the chat, which I think is a great observation, because that's what I see happening in our church right now. And Tanya was talking about, you know, and the size of our church kind of fluctuates. Right now, it's hard to tell, but I think God has given us an opportunity, a huge opportunity, and it's even an answer to many prayers during this time of COVID and things going up and down and we're in it right now, Tanya. We have this group of people right here who all have gifts, who God is calling to use those gifts in the next season of our ministry. And so I think you pointed out exactly what's happening right now, which is that God will take these groups of people, these small groups of people, and each of those persons can act as a part of this body, of this own little body of people that can go out and multiply and, continue that wheel of discipleship. And so not only is that something God does, he's doing it right now in our church, in this Bible study, and in other places as well. So something to think about.
There's two other things I'll just take quick mention of in the chat. That one of them is that there is a sense of what is the right size of a church, and I want to press against that idea for a moment. That the church should only get as big. I mean, really should only get as big as the leadership is gifted to care for those that have been entrusted to it. At the point that legitimate care, can no longer be afforded, the church has gotten too large. But in the environment where there is strategic thinking on how to offer care, then the size of the church should not be limited by our notion of what we feel most comfortable with. And I get that really out of the book of Acts, where, I mean, they blew up. They had 2,000 people come to Christ in one day, right? I mean, it's like, and probably it was 2,000 men, so it might have been 6,000. It might have been suddenly a large church. And we see the apostles coming together and saying, wait a second, we're spending too much time doing care and not leading. We need to be distributing the workload differently. And they got a computer program called Asana, and they started making tasks, and they put together, I don't know if they had, how they did it, but they had deacons and offices and people that were caring for widows and orphans, and there was administration that they put into place, and all this stuff that allowed them to do that. And they divided themselves into house churches so that there would be shepherds over little homes of churches and care that was being administered. And they put together really quickly strategies that were employed to allow the church to not be limited in its effectiveness at reaching people far from God. And that is the thing. It's so often that our small groups feel like they've reached the right size once I get in there. And that's the danger that we all bring into whatever building group or space that we enter into, is that now that I'm here, that's enough. And now that I'm here, we should stop growing. And we got to be really careful about recognizing that, no, we need to make sure that we create the infrastructure to support and care for, because there are people all around us that will perish in an eternity without God if we don't make the difference in this culture. And our counties are losing ground. Our churches are losing ground. We are not more effective than when we first began at reaching people who are far from God. Our counties are going to hell, and this is our watch. We've got to figure out how to get as many people into the kingdom on our watch as we possibly can. Secondly, the thing I've got written down about Manda is that she is a pot stirrer. No, I'm just kidding. I don't have that. That's what Jenny has written down about me. Okay. Any last things that you want to mention? Because we are, unfortunately, believe it or not, out of time. I look up at the clock and it is already that time. I can hardly believe it. It feels like I just got here with you.
Oh, I think we got through one question, maybe.
Evidently, one was enough.
One was enough.
Yeah. Cool.
Todd, will you pray over us this morning?
I sure will. Father God, thank you for a beautiful morning. Thank you for the time of sharing and fellowship, of learning and growing. And Father, as I think about this question that we pondered about the roles of people in the church, what I'm reminded of, Lord, is that there is a place for all of us. There is a role for every single one of us, whether you've gifted us with specific talents or abilities, Father. But my hope and my prayer is that you would give us each a heart to realize that we do have an important part, that your word doesn't get spread without us, that the influence of your word and your love doesn't get shared unless we're the ones who share it. And so, Lord, I just ask that for today, you would help us to seek out those opportunities where we might be little beacons of your light and your love, that as we go through our day, that there will be opportunities that will be put before us that we won't ignore, but that we'll take advantage of, Father, to share your love, whatever it might be, whether it's a handful of dried fruit and a cup of water, or whether it's something much bigger than that. Lord, I just ask that you would give us hearts to serve and to seek out the needs of other people and do it through your love, Father. Thank you for today. Thank you for the people here. I just ask your blessings on each and every one. And Lord, just make it a great day in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.